Hey, what's up everyone? How's it going? This is Watch. Hope you guys are all doing well. And in this video, I'm doing a full review of the new 12-inch MacBook with the Retina display. I've been using it for a couple of days now, and I'm here to share my thoughts and opinions on it. This video is specifically designed for any of you guys out there that are just interested in seeing what this thing has to offer, both the good and bad, and perhaps you're even wondering to upgrade to the 12-inch, and I'll tell you why that may or may not be a good idea. So let's get right into my full review. Now, the important thing to mention is that this computer is a completely new redesign from the ground up, and Apple has chosen this computer to represent the MacBook name that they've brought back. So now you have three MacBook models to choose from. You have the MacBook Pro, the MacBook Air, and I guess this fits right in between those two models. Now, the one thing I like about the 12-inch is the compact size. In fact, in terms of thickness, it only measures about 3.5 to 13.1 millimeters in terms of its thickness, and in terms of weight, it's just under 1 kilograms, measuring about 920 grams. Extremely light, and there's really not a lot of notebooks you can compare this to when it comes to the compact profile and weight. Now, in terms of build quality and fit and finish, it's up there with Apple's best products. It's milled to perfection, extremely precise. You can tell by the distance between the keyboard and the actual edge of the laptop that this thing is hard to manufacture, and one of the reasons why it costs so much. Now, one kind of disadvantage is the fact that the hinge on the laptop itself is a little bit loose. The screen likes to wobble around a little bit if you knock it back and forth, and certainly I wish that it was a little bit more stiffer, because even at times when I was typing, the screen was wobbling back and forth. But those are all pretty minor issues that some people probably won't even care about. Now, in terms of the battery life, internally the MacBook logic board in this thing is very tiny, and they've used actually most of the space internally to actually maximize the battery capacity. They've even tiered the sides to get the most battery possible, but even with that, you basically have a 29 watt-hour lithium polymer battery, and it's using pretty much the same technology as previous generation MacBooks, which have a lot higher capacity, and as a result of that, you're not getting tremendous battery life. I managed around 8-hour 30-minute mark after a couple of days of usage, and I basically did a little bit of web browsing and just did my normal everyday routine. With the same behavior habits, I get over 13 hours on my MacBook Air and around 10 hours on the new 2015 MacBook Pro. So in both cases, looks like this machine isn't up to par in terms of battery performance than what the other MacBooks can do, which is kind of upsetting to see. Now, one of the major new features on this computer is the new trackpad and the new keyboard. Now, the new keyboard is pretty much the same layout as the previous generation MacBook keyboards, but it's completely different in terms of design. It's a lot lower profile. One of the reasons why this computer is so thin is they've moved from a scissor mechanism switch to a butterfly mechanism switch, which allows the keys to be a lot thinner in terms of their profile, but you lose a lot of the travel distance as a result of that. Now, me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of slim profile keyboards, and I miss the kind of tactile sensation I get when using the keyboards on the MacBook Air and Pro, which gives you a lot more recoil and feedback when you're typing. That just gives you a better sensation in my personal experience, and although you get used to the new keyboard, it's kind of weird that the keys are completely almost flush to the body itself. Furthermore, we have a new backlight system on the 12-inch. They're basically individually LED backlit compared to the more global illumination system we had on the MacBook Air and Pro. But I have to admit that I honestly didn't see any big difference between the new backlight compared to the previous generation. I thought that the previous keyboard was illuminated pretty evenly based on my personal experience. So even though the new MacBook is individually lit, in reality it doesn't make a big difference. Now, moving forward, the new MacBook is using the Force Touch trackpad that we've encountered on the 2015 MacBook Pro, and one of the cool things about this touchpad is there are no moving parts, so there's actually no physical click. It's all emulated. There's an electromagnetic motor underneath the trackpad, which is extremely impressive to see, because basically that area is just around 4 to 5 millimeters thick, so very impressive that Apple could fit all those little components in such a tiny area. Now, since the trackpad itself is pressure sensitive, you can do a couple of different commands if you don't know already. If you're in Safari, you can force click on a highlighted word and get a definition or Wikipedia entry for that word. You can also add new contacts, and if you're in certain apps such as the QuickTime player, you can even fast forward and rewind a movie based on the pressure that you're sending to the trackpad. It'll give you a little vibration every time you increase or decrease the pressure. Very interesting sensation that I haven't experienced before. Now moving on, let's talk about one of the biggest features of this computer, and that's the Retina display. It's a 12-inch diagonal display that is LED backlit with IPS technology, so it's viewable at pretty much every angle you can think of. And in terms of resolution, it's 2404 by 1440, giving a PPI count of 226. And the overall user experience of the display is up there with what you get with the 13-inch MacBook Pro Retina. Now, the other nice thing about this computer is the external speakers. They're completely redesigned and they're located at the top where you can actually see them. So the sound is much better than the previous generation MacBooks. And let's go ahead and take a quick sample and listen to how these speakers sound in real life. Now moving forward, let's take a look at the internal specs we have on the 12-inch MacBook. Now, it's basically using the Intel Core M CPU. That's a new generation Intel processor. We have the baseline configuration over here. As you can see, it comes with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and it has 256 gigabytes of internal flash memory. But let's go ahead and do some benchmarking and see how fast it actually is. We're going to start with Geekbench 3. We're just going to run this benchmark over here, and here are the results. You can see that we're getting about 2400 in terms of the single core score and about 4600 on the multi-core score, and you can compare this with a computer that you existingly have. But this is actually slower than the 2015 version of the Air and Pro. Additionally, in terms of the Cinebench benchmark, which is going to test out our CPU performance specifically, we're getting about 205 points, and again, that's quite a bit slower than what we get on the MacBook Pro and Air as well. Now, one surprising notion is that the internal flash memory on this computer is, again, quite a bit slower than what we're getting on the current lineup of MacBook computers, getting just over 770 megabytes per second in terms of read speeds and about over 470 megabytes per second in terms of the write speed based on our Blackmagic speed test. And funny enough, this is about actually almost half the speed as what we're getting on the current generation Air and Pro, where they're getting almost double the speed. So that's definitely upsetting to see over here. Now, moving on, we're going to take a look at the gaming performance on this computer. Now, this doesn't have the best GPU performance. It's basically using the integrated HD 5300 series GPU built inside the Intel Core M processor. And we're just going to use our Heaven benchmark. We're going to set the resolution to 1280 by 800, set the detail settings to medium, no anti-aliasing, and we're basically getting about 14 average frames per second with a score about 353, which is not bad. Now, I actually did a little bit of gaming over here. I played a little bit of Dota 2, and I actually got a pretty good experience. I had no problems in setting the resolution to around 720p and with pretty overall playable frame rates, especially when you're playing RTS and things like that. Now, you're not going to be doing any kind of serious graphical work over here or doing any kind of video editing whatsoever, because internally this thing is not capable of those kind of things. But you can do a little bit of casual gaming, as you can see. Now, just to kind of sum up everything, let's go ahead and do a pros and cons list to kind of get a better idea of what this 12-inch has to offer. We'll start with the pros of the computer. Firstly, I have to say that it is extremely lightweight, extremely compact, and 12 inches is just a great size for an Ultrabook PC, and Apple has done an excellent job in terms of engineering this computer to be as compact as possible. There's really not a lot of computers that are around 13 millimeters in terms of its maximum thickness and just under 1 kilogram in terms of its weight. So it's more in lines of a tablet than really anything else. Next, even though I'm not the biggest fan of the new keyboard, I do like the fact that we have larger keycaps on the 12-inch compared to the previous generation MacBook keyboard, which definitely makes typing a little bit easier than before. Plus, I like the design of the arrow keys, and the escape key is extended as well. Now next, probably one of the biggest highlights on this computer definitely has to be that Retina display. It has a super high resolution, a very high pixel density, so your images and text looks really sharp no matter what resolution you set it at. Additionally, the colors are very vibrant and saturated, which is definitely nice to see when you're watching videos or looking at photos and things like that. And plus, since it's IPS, you can view it at pretty much any angle and get minimal dips in terms of the color saturation and brightness. So very versatile screen. Continuing forth, it's really cool that Apple has engineered the internals to be completely fanless. It's passively cooled, so silent operation. So you pretty much never hear the computer running no matter what you're doing. Another great feature is that the computer runs extremely cool for being completely passively cooled. You can easily put it on your lap and never have to worry about burning yourself. Continuing forward, I'm also a fan of the external speakers we have on this thing. It does a pretty good job of delivering pretty clear audio with a decent amount of bass as well. Now, the last thing I like about the MacBook is the fact that we have USB Type-C. Now, I understand it's a huge disadvantage that it's the only port we have in the entire machine, but like it or not, this is the future of universal connections. You're going to have all these products that are going to come out in the future that will be able to connect to this, whether that be a display, an accessory, whatever. The fact that it is reversible is a nice touch as well. It just kind of sucks that you're going to have to deal with adapters for the time being. Now let's talk about some of the things that I didn't like about the new 12-inch MacBook. Firstly, I understand that they had to make the keyboard as slim as possible to maintain the 13mm overall thickness, but the fact of the matter is it's not as tactile, as responsive as the old keyboard. I'm not the biggest fan of slim profile keyboards, and you certainly lose something when you make a keyboard this thin. Moving forward, even though I don't mind the new Force Touch trackpad, one of the biggest concerns I have with it is when you're trying to execute a force and drag command. So if you want to drag a icon in your desktop to somewhere else, it becomes kind of tricky to balance the amount of pressure you have to put on the trackpad, because if you press too hard, you'll execute a force click, and that will just give you a preview of that file. Additionally, you can also accidentally execute a force click when you're trying to highlight some text, and even though you can go into the trackpad settings menu and change the amount of pressure that it takes to execute a force click, but eventually I think most people will find the balance of how much pressure to put on the trackpad before they execute a force click. But I also feel that some people might turn off that feature altogether, like I did. Additionally, one of the other major issues I have with the 12-inch is regarding battery life. Now, even though 8.5 hours to 9 hours for web browsing isn't bad and certainly higher than average compared to most of your Windows-based Ultrabooks, it's certainly lagging behind of what the MacBook Pro can do and what the MacBook Air can do. Based on my experience, I got over 13 hours of web browsing on the Air versus I managed to get about 8.5 hours on the 12-inch. And when you start comparing the price difference between the two, things can get certainly problematic. Now, as we mentioned before, certainly one of the biggest issue is going to be the fact that you don't have a lot of ports and connectivity options on this thing. Basically, just one USB Type-C port. And even though that's great for the future, but for the time being, it's a huge headache. If you have a USB thumb drive that somebody gives you and you're trying to transfer data back and forth, you're going to need an adapter for that. If you want to hook this up to your external monitor, you're going to need an adapter for that. You're going to need adapters for pretty much everything, because not a lot of things are natively USB Type-C enabled. So that's a huge problem that early adopters will have to face when getting this thing. Now, the other issue I have with this computer is regarding the front-facing webcam. It's only 480p in terms of its resolution versus the MacBook Air and Pro both come with 720p front-facing cameras. So that's kind of upsetting to see, and you can see the quality isn't great as well. Moving forward, another problem is regarding the internals. Now, basically, this is a glorified iPad, and the Intel Core M processor may be cool and quiet in terms of its operation, but it's not the quickest thing out there. In fact, it's quite a bit slower than what the MacBook Pro and Air can do. Also, having 8GB of RAM is great for bragging rights, but since the processor isn't powerful enough to do some serious number crunching, you're never going to be pushing the system resources where the 8GB of RAM becomes useful. Moreover, the internal flash memory we have on the 12-inch is actually about half the speed of what the MacBook Air and what the MacBook Pro is delivering in terms of read and write performance, which is certainly sad to see considering the premium cost of the 12-inch MacBook. And last but not least, one of the biggest problems I have is regarding the price tag. Basically, this retails for around $1,300, the same exact price of what the 13-inch MacBook Pro goes for, and it's about $300 more than the 13-inch MacBook Air. So at that price, you would think that this would offer better performance than the MacBook Air and would offer something that the MacBook Pro doesn't. And certainly in terms of size, it's definitely the winner there. You can't get a machine that's light and as thin as this, and it's certainly in the middle when it comes to those factors. And the display is great, as we mentioned before, but the internals and the battery life is just not up to the level as what we're experiencing on the other lineup of computers. Now, one thing I think Apple should have done is offered a version of this computer that comes with 4 gigabytes of RAM instead of 8 gigabytes and offers 128 gigabytes of internal flash memory instead of 256. I think if they had that option, they could cut a huge chunk out of that price tag and fit it right into the middle between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro where it belongs. Unfortunately, that's not the case. You have no option to get lower amount of RAM and lower amount of system storage. You're kind of stuck with the models that we have right now, which definitely kind of sucks for people that want to try out this computer, because I think the form factor and design is really quite killer. There's just some huge internal challenges that people are going to have to justify that high price tag. But what I would recommend to anybody that's interested in the 12 inches, go out, try it out yourself, see if it's fast enough for you, and if so, perhaps you can justify that high price tag. Although I think in terms of value, I think the MacBook Air is still the king of the castle when it comes to those kind of factors. And if you need more power on your laptop, the Pro is great as well. Now, definitely check out our main channel where you'll find those direct head-to-head comparisons, as well as some other comparisons between this thing and other great Ultrabooks such as the XPS 13. So if you haven't already checked those videos out on our channel, make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and we'll see you later. Take care.